The holographic transmission flickered to life in the underground war room, casting eerie blue light against the cold metal walls. The room was silent, save for the steady hum of the power core embedded deep beneath Geneva's fortified command center. Around the holotable, Earth's most powerful military minds stood frozen, their faces tense as they stared at the towering figure projected before them. The alien warlord was massive, standing at least 9 feet tall with armored scales that gleamed like molten obsidian. His elongated skull bore a crown of bony ridges, his slitted amber eyes radiating a cruel intelligence. Draped in regal battlewear, he exuded the authority of a conqueror who had crushed countless worlds beneath his heel. "I am Warlord Vashroth of the Sunvar Dominion," he declared, his voice reverberating like rolling thunder. "Earth has been observed and deemed insignificant. Your existence is tolerated only as long as it serves our needs." He lifted one clawed hand, talons gleaming under the transmission's flickering light. "You surrender your planetary resources and pledge fealty to the Dominion. In return, you will be permitted to survive under our rule. Refuse, and your world will burn." A suffocating stillness gripped the war room. General David Jones narrowed his eyes, his square jaw tightening. The scar across his cheek, a relic from Earth's last global war, twitched as his grip on the table's edge hardened. He had fought battles against men before, but this was a war against something beyond humanity's worst nightmares. The transmission cut abruptly, leaving the room in stark silence. A thick tension filled the air. Adrian Harrison, standing just beside Jones, let out a low breath. "Well," he said, arms crossed over his broad chest. "That was subtle." Ryan Richardson scoffed from his place near the data console, shaking his head. "They've already decided. That wasn't a request, it was a death sentence." "They think we'll kneel," Jones said, his voice low and steady. He leaned forward, placing both hands on the hollow table. "They expect submission. They expect annihilation," Colonel Harrison corrected. His sharp blue eyes flickered with restrained anger. "We're nothing to them, just another species to subjugate." General Jones straightened, sweeping his gaze across the room. "I want a full assessment of our defensive capabilities. Richardson, give me a read on our fleet strength." Richardson's fingers flew across the hollow controls. Data scrolled in midair, reflecting cold numbers and strategic projections. His cybernetic eye flickered faintly as he processed the information at an accelerated speed. "Not great," he admitted. "We've got 2 full battle groups stationed around Mars and the asteroid belt. Our orbital defense platforms are active, but they're not designed to handle a full-scale invasion. Earth's surface defenses are operational, but if they hit us from orbit, we won't last long." Jones absorbed the report in silence. He already knew the numbers, but hearing them spoken aloud solidified the dire reality they faced. Harrison exhaled sharply. "And if we surrender?" No one answered. The question hung in the air, heavy and unwelcome. Finally, Jones spoke. "We don't." The certainty in his tone sent a ripple through the room. Surrender meant slavery, meant generations of humans bent beneath the Dominion's rule, their children raised as subjects to an empire that saw them as nothing more than biological resources. It was a future Jones refused to accept. "Then we're at war," Harrison said, nodding. A deep rumble shook the bunker. The monitors around the room flickered. The overhead lights dimmed for a split second before stabilizing. Richardson's hands danced across the console, pulling up external surveillance feeds. The war room's primary screen flared to life, displaying Earth's orbital defense grid. The stars beyond shimmered, but something else loomed on the periphery of the display. Then the image sharpened. Sunvar warships. Hundreds of them. They had already arrived. "Jesus," Richardson muttered. Harrison let out a low whistle, though his expression was anything but amused. They didn't wait for an answer. Jones stood unmoving, his jaw clenched so tightly it could have been carved from stone. His voice, when it came, was sharp and unyielding. They never needed one. Across the war room, officers scrambled, issuing emergency directives. Earth's planetary alert system engaged. Sirens howled across the globe. In every major city, people gazed upward as the night sky became blotted out by the encroaching shadows of war. The Sunvar fleet moved with terrifying precision, their warships gliding into formation like a cosmic execution squad. They're deploying bombardment platforms, Richardson reported. His voice was controlled, but there was an unmistakable urgency behind it. If we don't act fast, they'll glass entire continents before we get a shot off. Jones' mind worked through the chaos, his decades of combat experience filtering options through a razor-sharp lens. This was not a war humanity had been prepared for, but it was a war they would fight. "Patch me through to every military command on the planet," he ordered. Richardson nodded, fingers blurring over the interface. A moment later, a red light blinked on the console, signaling a global broadcast link. Jones stepped forward. His voice was iron. "This is General David Jones of the United Earth Defense Forces. The Sunvar Dominion has declared war upon our world. They believe us weak, unworthy of resistance. They are wrong." The words echoed across every military installation, every underground command center, every warship stationed from Earth to Mars. The weight of them settled into the bones of every soldier, pilot, and strategist. "We stand not just as nations, but as one people. We fight not just for survival, but for the right to exist as free men. The Sunvar have come to erase us. Instead, they will learn the cost of underestimating humanity." He took a breath, his gaze hard as steel. "We do not surrender. We do not kneel. We fight." A beat of silence followed. Then the war room erupted into controlled chaos. Orders flew across communication channels. Earth's battle groups scrambled into position. Anti-orbital rail cannons powered up. Stealth bombers engaged. Across the planet, human forces mobilized. Harrison cracked his knuckles, a small smirk creeping onto his otherwise grim features. "Now that," he said, "was a hell of a speech." Richardson didn't look up from his console. "It won't mean anything if we get wiped out in the first hour." "We won't," Jones said firmly. The ground rumbled again as the first plasma blasts from the Sunvar fleet streaked through the upper atmosphere. The battle had begun, and Earth would not go quietly. The void of space trembled with the fury of war. High above Earth, the Sunvar fleet moved like a swarm of obsidian leviathans, their warships eclipsing the light of distant stars. The lead battleships descended toward the planet's orbit, their long, serrated hulls bristling with weaponry designed to shatter moons. Inside Geneva's war room, General David Jones studied the real-time battle feed with an expression carved from stone. The first Sunvar bombardment had devastated Earth's outermost defenses. Several orbital platforms had been reduced to glowing wreckage, their twisted remains plummeting toward the planet like dying embers. Lunar Base Hadrian, once a proud symbol of human expansion, had fallen silent. No survivors. Jones exhaled slowly, suppressing the weight of the loss. There was no time for mourning. Colonel Adrian Harrison leaned over the hollow table, his sharp blue eyes flicking between tactical readouts. "They're trying to pin us down," he muttered. "Cut off our ability to maneuver before they start glassing entire cities." Ryan Richardson's cybernetic-enhanced gaze analyzed the Sunvar fleet's movement. His fingers moved with methodical precision, bringing up data streams, energy readings, and ship trajectories. "Their fleet isn't as clustered as it should be," he noted. "They're overconfident. They think our fleet's already crippled." He looked up at Jones. "We can use that." Jones considered the information, his mind a battlefield of calculations. "We need to hit them where it hurts," he decided. "If we strike now, we can buy ourselves enough time to rally the fleet." Harrison cracked his knuckles. "Tell me we're launching a boarding assault." Jones nodded. "We'll disable one of their dreadnoughts from the inside. If we can hack their systems and disrupt their coordination, it'll give our forces a fighting chance. A slow grin spread across Harrison's face. I do love a good knife fight. The UEDF cruiser Vanguard sliced through the darkness of space, its hull cloaked in active camouflage as it drifted undetected toward the enemy formation. Inside, a squad of elite commandos, including Harrison, suited up in zero-G combat gear, their faces grim beneath their visors. Harrison tightened the straps of his combat harness and checked the charge on his plasma blade. "Remember," he said, addressing his men, "we don't need to take the whole ship. Just long enough for Richardson to do his thing." Assuming I don't get shot in the process, Richardson quipped from his station near the airlock. The pilot's voice crackled through their comms. "Brace for launch." A moment later, the Vanguard released a series of stealth pods, each one no larger than a coffin. The pods tumbled silently through the void, their heat signatures masked against enemy scanners. The Sunvar dreadnought loomed ahead, a monolithic fortress of alien engineering. As the pods neared the ship's hull, their magnetic clamps engaged, locking them in place. Harrison's pod door hissed open. He moved fast, cutting through the ship's exterior plating with a plasma torch. The moment the breach was complete, he slipped inside, weapon raised. The corridor was dimly lit, its metallic walls pulsing with faint, bioluminescent veins. The air smelled sterile, tinged with something acrid. The Sunvar had yet to detect them. Harrison signaled his team forward, their boots soundless against the floor. They moved with practiced efficiency, weaving through the labyrinthine corridors toward the dreadnought's command center. Richardson, tucked behind Harrison, scanned the ship's systems with a wrist-mounted device. "I'm tapping into their comms," he whispered. "They're focusing all their attention on the battle outside. They have no idea we're here." Harrison smirked. "Let's keep it that way." They rounded a corner and nearly walked straight into a Sunvar patrol. The reptilian warriors stood at least 8 feet tall, their armor an interlocking mesh of organic plating and reinforced alloys. Their slitted eyes widened in alarm, and in an instant the corridor erupted into chaos. Harrison moved first, lunging forward with brutal efficiency. His plasma blade ignited with a hiss, slicing through the nearest Sunvar's throat before the alien could react. A second enemy raised a weapon, but Richardson fired first, a rail pistol shot punching through the alien's skull. The remaining Sunvar roared, their weapons discharging arcs of searing energy. Harrison dodged, rolling beneath a blast and driving his blade up into his opponent's gut. The alien spasmed before collapsing in a heap. The skirmish was over in seconds. Richardson exhaled. "Well, there goes the stealth approach." Harrison wiped alien blood from his visor. It was bound to happen. A distant alarm howled through the ship, signaling their presence. Jones' voice came through their comms. "You need to move. Now." Harrison didn't need to be told twice. He and his team sprinted toward the command center, ducking through bulkheads as security doors slammed shut behind them. Richardson worked furiously to override the ship systems, rerouting pathways to keep them ahead of their pursuers. They reached the command chamber, a vast, circular room dominated by a pulsing core of alien technology. Holoscreens projected Sunvar fleet movements in real time, their warships forming a noose around Earth's remaining defenses. Richardson plugged into the system, his cybernetic implant interfacing with the alien network. "I just need a minute." They didn't have a minute. The doors burst open, and a squad of heavily armored Sunvar stormed in, weapons raised. Harrison barely had time to react before he was thrown back by the force of a plasma blast. His armor absorbed most of the impact, but the pain still flared white-hot in his ribs. He rolled onto his knees, gritting his teeth. The Sunvar commander stepped forward, his dark scales shimmering under the dim light. "You fight with bravery," the alien said, his voice a deep, guttural rumble. "But bravery will not save your kind." Harrison spat blood onto the floor. "Yeah," he growled. Neither will monologues. He lunged. The Sunvar commander was fast, but Harrison was faster. He drove his plasma blade into the alien's side, twisting the hilt as the weapon burned through flesh and armor alike. The Sunvar snarled, swinging a clawed hand at Harrison's head, but the soldier ducked and delivered a brutal kick to the enemy's knee, sending him crashing to the floor. The remaining Sunvar opened fire. Harrison dove behind a console, returning shots as best he could. "Richardson," he barked. "Almost there." The ship shuddered violently. Outside, Earth's forces surged forward in a coordinated counterattack. Richardson had successfully fed false data into the Sunvar fleet systems, disrupting their formations. Several enemy vessels collided as their navigation went haywire. Jones' voice cut through the chaos. "We've got an opening. Fall back now." Harrison fired one last shot before grabbing Richardson by the arm. They sprinted back through the corridors, gunfire ringing behind them. They barely made it to the escape pods before the dreadnought began to implode. The moment their pod launched, Harrison let out a ragged breath. Earth had landed its first strike. The war had turned into a brutal chess match, one where every move carried the weight of a species' survival. Earth's forces had struck a nerve, but the Sunvar Dominion was not retreating. If anything, they had only become more determined to wipe humanity from existence. Their fleet reformed into a tighter siege formation, adjusting to the chaos Earth had injected into their ranks. They had lost a dreadnought, but they had hundreds more. General David Jones stood at the helm of Earth's remaining command center, his gaze fixed on the hollow display before him. The battle in orbit was still raging, but the tide was shifting against them. Despite the momentary advantage they had gained, the Sunvar's superior numbers were closing the gap. Colonel Adrian Harrison leaned against the console, blood crusted along his jaw from the boarding operation. He had barely made it out of the enemy ship alive, but there was no time for rest. "We can't keep this up, David," he muttered. "We fight straight, we die straight." Ryan Richardson adjusted his cybernetic interface, scanning the enemy formations. "They're adapting faster than expected," he admitted. "But they haven't changed their approach. Their movements suggest they still think we're fighting defensively." He tapped the display, highlighting their pattern. "They believe we're just holding out." Jones turned to face them both. "Then it's time we make them believe something else." Silence settled over the room as his meaning took shape. Harrison narrowed his eyes. "You want to trick them into making a mistake?" Jones nodded. "Not just any mistake. A fatal one?" Richardson leaned closer, intrigued. "You have an idea?" The general's expression was unreadable, but his tone carried the weight of a gamble no sane commander would take unless faced with total extinction. "We let them think they've won." Harrison let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "David, if you're suggesting what I think you are, that's damn near suicide." "It's our only option," Jones countered. "We have a fleet positioned on the dark side of the moon, hidden from their scanners. If we can bait them into overextending, make them push too deep into our airspace, they'll expose their command carrier. If we take that out, the entire fleet loses coordination. They'll still be dangerous, but they won't be unstoppable." Richardson ran a hand through his hair. "Considering the logistics, we'd have to make it convincing. They need to believe we're on the verge of collapse." Jones gave a curt nod. "That means pulling back our outer defenses, making it look like we're scattering. When they think we've lost control, they'll press forward, right into our trap." Harrison crossed his arms, jaw tight. "And what happens if they don't take the bait?" "Then we die," Jones said simply. The plan was set in motion within the hour. Earth's remaining fleet, those still capable of flight, began a strategic retreat, falling back in what appeared to be uncoordinated desperation. Frigates broke formation. Cruisers veered off as if they were trying to escape the onslaught. From the Sunvar's perspective, humanity was finally breaking. On the bridge of the enemy command carrier, Warlord Vashroth observed the chaos with a gleam of satisfaction in his slitted eyes. His lieutenant, a towering Sunvar with crimson-hued scales, bowed deeply. "They run," the lieutenant rumbled. Vashroth let out a low growl of amusement. "Of course they do. They are nothing more than frightened mammals scrambling in the face of annihilation." He turned to his command crew, raising one clawed hand. "Advance. Crush what remains of their resistance." The Sunvar fleet surged forward. From Earth's surface, Jones watched the movements play out exactly as predicted. His fingers curled into a fist at his side. "Now," he murmured. The hidden fleet on the dark side of the moon erupted from concealment. In an instant, what the Sunvar thought was victory transformed into devastation. Earth's reserve forces emerged like wraiths from the shadows, striking at the exposed underbelly of the Sunvar fleet. Railguns fired. Plasma lances burned through enemy hulls. Harrison led the first wave, piloting a gunship straight into the chaos. "Let's show these bastards what humans can do." The Sunvar were caught in the worst possible position. Their command carrier, normally protected at the fleet's rear, was now in the direct line of fire. On board the enemy flagship, Vashrotha's smug expression darkened into fury. "Impossible," he snarled. Richardson, back in Geneva, grinned as he flooded the Sunvar systems with false telemetry. "Looks like they're learning something new about us." The battle turned into a brutal melee. Human forces struck with the desperation of a species that refused to go quietly. The Sunvar, blindsided and enraged, fought back with the ferocity of cornered predators. Ships on both sides burned, metal ripped apart in the silence of space. Harrison's gunship weaved through the carnage, dodging incoming fire. His targeting reticle locked onto the enemy command carrier. "Time to cut off the head." Jones' voice crackled through his comms. "Harrison, you're clear to engage." The colonel pushed the throttle forward. Firing, the railgun round screamed through the void. It struck true. The Sunvar command carrier buckled, its shields overtaxed, its hull rupturing. Secondary explosions ignited along its structure as containment fields collapsed. Without its leader, the enemy fleet began to falter. Earth's forces pressed the attack. The once impenetrable Sunvar armada fractured. Victory was within reach. But the battle was not over yet. The Sunvar command carrier burned like a dying sun, its fractured hull splitting apart in a chain of cascading explosions. Warlord Vashrotha's flagship, the very core of the invasion force, had been severed from the fleet's command network. Without centralized coordination, the enemy's formations faltered, their once impenetrable assault turning chaotic. And yet, even as Earth's forces pressed their advantage, the Sunvar refused to break. From the cockpit of his gunship, Colonel Adrian Harrison scanned the battle raging around him. Wreckage drifted in all directions, twisted fragments of human and Sunvar ships alike, tumbling in the cold abyss of space. Firefights erupted across the remains of shattered hulls, stranded soldiers engaging in desperate combat amidst the debris. The airwaves crackled with frantic reports from frontline captains. "They're not retreating." Richardson's voice came through Harrison's earpiece, his tone laced with both triumph and concern. "Even with their command carrier gone, they're still fighting. Hard." Harrison veered his ship away from an incoming blast, his knuckles tightening around the controls. "They've come too far to back down. Even cornered, they'd rather die than admit defeat." General David Jones stood in Geneva's underground war room, his weary eyes fixed on the holomap displaying the battle's every chaotic moment. He knew Harrison was right. The Sunvar weren't just an invading force. They were zealots of conquest. They had no word for surrender. To them, death was preferable to dishonor. Jones turned toward the comms officer. "Patch me through to every available Earth fleet," he ordered. A moment later, his voice rang across every surviving warship. "This is General David Jones to all UEDF forces. We have broken their command structure, but the Sunvar will not yield. Do not assume they will flee. This is where we end them." Across the fleet, Battered, but resolute soldiers clenched their weapons tighter. Pilots adjusted their course. Captains gave the order to push forward. Humanity had endured too much, fought too hard, to let the enemy slip through their fingers now. Harrison maneuvered through the wreckage, targeting a Sanvar cruiser that had begun charging its main cannons. He flipped a switch, launching a pair of high-yield torpedoes. The first struck the ship's shielding, rippling the energy barrier apart. The second slammed into its exposed core. The explosion was immediate, sending shockwaves through the surrounding debris. "Scratch another one," he muttered, banking left as return fire blazed past his wing. But then something caught his eye. A massive Sanvar battleship, still intact, pushing forward despite the carnage. Its prow was marked with crimson insignias, a sign of the highest-ranking warriors among the Sanvar. This was no ordinary warship. This was their true flagship. Harrison's breath stilled. "Jones," he said, "I think I found our real problem." In Geneva, Richardson pulled up new scans. He's right. That ship wasn't just part of the fleet. It's their Sanctuary-class dreadnought. That means their highest-ranking warlords are still alive and coordinating manually. He swore under his breath. They had a failsafe, a contingency plan in case their command carrier fell. Jones exhaled slowly. "If that ship holds together, they can still win this war." Harrison's voice was steady. "Then we take it out." The problem was, the Sanvar dreadnought wasn't just another warship. It was a fortress. Its armor was thicker than any Earth weaponry had been designed to pierce. Conventional attacks would barely scratch it. Even Richardson, brilliant as he was, couldn't hack something that massive in the middle of battle. They needed another way. Jones knew it, and he knew only one option remained. "We take it from the inside," he said. There was silence over the comms. Then Harrison's voice, grim but resolute. "When do we start?" 15 minutes later, a strike team launched from the vanguard, moving through the debris field like ghosts. Harrison, leading the charge, piloted his dropship through the chaos. Plasma fire rained around them as the Sanvar dreadnought's defenses activated, turrets swiveling to track their approach. Richardson worked furiously from the war room, rerouting signals, shutting down sensors wherever he could. "I can buy you maybe 30 seconds of blind spots at a time," he warned. "Use them well." Harrison didn't answer. He was too busy flying through hell. The dropship shuddered as they breached the dreadnought's outer hull. Magnetic clamps engaged, locking them onto the surface. The team wasted no time, cutting through the metal plating and dropping into the ship's interior. The corridors were a maze of living metal, the walls pulsing with an eerie bioluminescence. The air was thick, humid, almost organic. The Sanvar had designed their ships not just as war machines, but as living extensions of themselves. Harrison moved fast, his team following close behind. They had one goal: reach the ship's main reactor and overload it. Sanvar warriors met them at every turn. The fighting was brutal, close quarters, blades flashing, plasma discharges searing the air. Harrison fought like a man possessed, cutting down enemies with lethal efficiency. His plasma blade carved through armor, his sidearm dispatching those who got too close. But the Sanvar were relentless. They fought with the desperation of a species that knew it stood on the edge of extinction. One of Harrison's men fell, a Sanvar blade driven through his chest. Another was blasted apart by a plasma rifle. There was no time to grieve, only time to push forward. They reached the reactor chamber, a colossal sphere of unstable energy, held in place by an intricate network of conduits. Richardson's voice came through the comms, rapid and urgent. "You need to overload the failsafes manually. There's no remote access. You'll have to set the detonation from inside." Harrison exhaled. "Understood." He moved to the controls, fingers flying across the interface. The ship groaned around them, the systems reacting violently to his intrusion. Then the doors burst open. Warlord Vashroth himself strode in, his towering frame casting a monstrous silhouette. His armor was scarred but unbroken, his crimson eyes burning with fury. "You defile my vessel," he growled. Harrison turned to face him, his plasma blade igniting with a sharp hum. "You defiled our planet," he shot back. Vashroth lunged. The duel was brutal. Every strike sent sparks flying. Harrison dodged, countered, his every movement calculated. But the Sunvar was stronger, faster. A backhanded blow sent Harrison crashing against the control panel. The warlord raised his blade for the final strike. Harrison rolled, grabbing his sidearm and firing point-blank into the alien's exposed side. The impact sent Vashroth stumbling back. Harrison didn't hesitate. He surged forward, driving his plasma blade up into the warlord's chest. The weapon burned through flesh and armor alike. Vashroth snarled, then went still. Harrison yanked the blade free. The warlord crumpled. The reactor alarm screamed. The overload sequence was locked in. Jones' voice came through the comms. "Harrison, you have 60 seconds to get out of there." He didn't need to be told twice. The strike team sprinted through the corridors, dodging fire, leaping over bodies. They reached the airlock just as the ship began to tremble violently. The dropship launched. Behind them, the Sunvar dreadnought detonated in a brilliant burst of fire and molten wreckage. The explosion rippled outward, consuming what remained of the enemy fleet. The Sunvar were finished. On Earth, in Geneva, in every surviving city, people watched as the last of the invaders fell. A cheer rose across the planet. Harrison, slumped in his seat, exhaled heavily. "That was close." Jones' voice carried through the comms, tired but victorious. "It's over?" For the first time in weeks, there was silence. And then, the stars belonged to humanity once more.